Okay, what's up everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Today what we're going to do is we're going to look at a typical Puritan sermon. Now, for those of us who have grown up in sort of evangelical or even Reformed churches, we have certain expectations for what we think a sermon is going to be like. For instance, there should be an introduction, and there should be three main points, and there should be some application at the end. But the Puritan sermon was far more complicated than that. And so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to do something like looking at an exploded diagram of what a Puritan sermon was actually like. They too had their own set of expectations. The hearer would very often come in and be seated in the congregation, and after singing some psalms and some prayers, of course, and as part of their worship service, then the sermon would begin, and sermons could usually be up to an hour, sometimes even 2 hours. Sometimes it was said that a man wasn't worth his salt if he couldn't preach for 2 turns of the dial, meaning 2-hour-long sermons. And the sermon is actually rather complex in terms of its constituent parts. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at something like an exploded diagram. Now, if you've ever done any engineering, or if you've taken apart an engine or even a lawnmower, you know what an exploded diagram is. It shows you how all the pieces fit together. And so we're going to be looking at a really cool sermon by Jonathan Edwards, which he preached in 1740. Right on the cusp of the First Great Awakening here in America, that wonderful time of revival that God poured out by His grace upon the colonies. And so we're going to be looking at a sermon called Zeal is an essential Christian virtue by Jonathan Edwards. Again, he preached this to his congregation. He was concerned that they were lacking zeal, and so we're going to use this as sort of our model sermon as we look at this exploded diagram. Now, before we get into that, I just want to say very quickly that I have my book available, a couple books on Jonathan Edwards. This one, A Theology of Joy, has been out for a little bit, but it recently came out in Audible. So if you want to listen to it, it's about 9 hours long. So if you're going on a trip, or you want to listen while you work, or while you clean the kitchen, or work out on the lawn, whatever you want to do, you can grab that on Audible, and I'll post a link in the description of this video. Okay? If you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew Everhard. I'm one of the pastors at Gospel Fellowship PCA, a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh, and I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary here in Pittsburgh, and we'd love for you to come check us out at rpts.edu. Okay, that all having been said, let's go ahead and switch into presentation mode here. Now, Edwards and everyone else would take a particular text as the main focus of their sermon. And in this case, in Edwards' sermon, Zeal, an Essential Christian Virtue, he gives us this text from Titus chapter 2, verse 14, who gave himself for us so that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify us unto himself, a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Okay, you're zealous for good works. So that's the text that Edwards was going to preach on. And here then is, as simple as I can make it, the 3 main points of the Puritan sermon. Every Puritan sermon, or at least most of them, I can't say all of them, but most of them, would start off with a particular text, a particular verse of the Bible or a passage of the Bible. It would then move into a doctrinal section, and then there would be an extended application at the end. Now, I was looking for kind of the perfect sermon that could really demonstrate all 3 of these things, and so the Zeal sermon is a pretty good sermon for that. But within this basic construct of text, doctrine, application, there's all kinds of variations that are possible. And one of the things that's a little bit unique about this sermon that we're going to look at is that the doctrinal section is larger than the application. Now, that's not always true. Quite often, in fact, the application would be the largest section of the sermon, and doctrine would be somewhat middling, and the text is still usually the shorter portion of the sermon, and Edwards' text part here is quite short indeed. But as we get into this, I want you to please be thinking of these 3 main points. If you get anything out of this little lecture here today, text, doctrine, application, that's the basic outline of the sermon. And pastors, if you're listening out there, you too can do something like this in your preaching. In fact, you probably wouldn't do something as complicated as Edwards is going to do here, or most Puritan sermons would be, but you could still probably learn a few things about how to structure sermons based on this basic grid and outline here, text, doctrine, application. So let's start here with the text portion. Now, for most Puritan sermons, and indeed for Jonathan Edwards, the text portion is the shortest portion of the sermon. It's really just the introduction. Now, today we have introductions that are usually personal, something humorous, something anecdotal, something that's happening in the culture. Puritans did not do that. Edwards did not do that. the introduction to every sermon was a statement of the context, the literary context or the historical context or the redemptive history context of where this passage is found, okay? What is it doing? What is the main idea? The opening bit of the sermon, usually just 5 or 10 minutes, is where the pastor just gives the basic context. This is the Sermon on the Mount, or this is the law from Deuteronomy 28, or this is the Sinai moment, or whatever. There would be just some basic introduction. Now here in this particular sermon, in the Zeal sermon, Edwards gives 3 little points, and they're all very, very short. This one right here on the screen is only the second point, so you can just kind of get the idea of what he's doing here. But he says here, in relation to this particular biblical text from Titus, we may take notice that this virtue is mentioned as part of the description of those that belong to Christ's invisible church. The people that are redeemed by Christ from all iniquity, and that Christ purifies to himself, and that are his peculiar people, are deciphered by this, that they are zealous of good works. This is here mentioned as a main part of their character, that they may be, and that by which they are distinguished from others. Okay, so Edwards is just basically giving you a little bit about the letter to Titus, and here especially why he's chosen this verse to be the main verse on which he's going to pin the rest of his particular sermon. And that's pretty much it for the text. So the first part is already over. Now, if you're thinking, oh, great, this is going to be a short sermon, hold on a second, because trust me, that's just the first opening foray. What's going to happen next is that Edwards is going to do the doctrinal section. And again, this is usually kind of a middle-sized section. The application is usually very long, but in this case, it's a little bit unusual that the doctrine is going to be the main section of the sermon, and the application is going to be somewhat shorter. So let me show you the doctrinal kinds of statements that you would see here. Typically, the doctrinal statement is one sentence. It's the thesis sentence for the whole sermon. In this case, it's very short and very clear, and Edwards' doctrinal statement is zeal is an essential virtue of a Christian. Okay, that's pretty simple. Now, sometimes the doctrinal statement can be far more complicated. It might be something about the nature of Christ, or the power of the atonement, or the Trinitarian essence of God, or the 3 persons of the Trinity. There could be anything for the doctrinal statement. But this one is very simple and very, very clear. And you say, well, okay, I guess we've said everything we can say about zeal, but no. The hallmark of the Puritan sermon is the way that a preacher could take one theme and weave it through so many ideas in terms of like just gritting this thing out in terms of showing everything that can be demonstrated about zeal. And this is what you're going to see in this sermon, that Edwards is almost brilliant from taking this concept of zeal from almost any particular perspective. Now, please take a snapshot or pause here if you have to. I want you to look at this. This is going to show you how complicated the zeal doctrine is going to be here. So first thing you're going to notice is that this doctrinal section has 2 main points, the first main and the second main, okay? So there's going to be 2 main points, which we're going to see here. But notice that under each of the main points, there's going to be 1, 2, or 3, what we're going to call sub-points. And you can track that in your mind pretty easily enough, but where it gets complicated is underneath the sub-points, there are other sub-points that we're going to call our tertiary points. So you can see here under the first sub, right here, you see that? There's going to be 5 tertiary points under the first sub of the first main, okay? So I'll try to help you keep up with this as we go. So let's get into it. So here are the 2 main points. The 2 main points, the main ideas of the doctrinal section. To clear this up, he says, first, describe this virtue or show what it is. So he's going to define what zeal is. Second, give the reasons why it's to be looked upon as an essential qualification of the Christian. So that's going to be the 2 main pillars of the doctrinal section. Now here we're going to get into the complexities of it. 1, I would show what is true Christian zeal. Christian zeal is a fervent disposition, an affection of mind in prosecuting that which is for God's glory and in opposing those things that are against it. So notice here, Edwards is using his hallmark language of an affection. He's going to call zeal an affection of mind, okay? And he thinks that this is something that all true Christians should have. So this is going to be the first pillar of his doctrinal section. Now, here we're going to get into the first subpoint and the first tertiary point, okay? First, viz., the affections in which true Christian zeal has its seat or which are exercised in it. And number 1 of the tertiary points, that affection that is principal in this virtue is love. Zeal is an inward heat or fervency of spirit, and love is the flame whence that heat comes. This is the fire that fills the soul with that holy fervor that is called zeal. Love to God and to Christ, divine love, is the foundation of all those other affections that are exercised in Christian zeal. Okay, so Edwards is rooting his idea of zeal, his definition of zeal, in one's love to God and to Christ. In other words, it is divine love. Second tertiary point under the first the first subpoint under the first main. Here you see how complicated this can be. From love to God arises a desire that he may be glorified. One way in which love is exercised in zeal is desire that this God, that is so beloved, may be pleased, and that his will may be done, that his commands may be obeyed, that his name may be glorified, and that he may be feared, that he may be loved, and that men may be holy as he is holy, and that his kingdom may be advanced, and that everything that is against these things may be removed. Third tertiary point. There is in zeal an aversion to what is contrary to God's command and glory. From that love, which is the principal thing in Christian zeal and the foundation of all of it, and the rest that is in it, arises a hatred. Now, okay, this is kind of interesting here, isn't it? Because what Edwards suggests here is not only zeal a true love for the glory of God. I mean, that's what he thinks to be zealous is to be one whose heart is in love with the Lord. But he also notes here, quite interestingly, that another affection arises, which would be hatred of the opposite. And so zeal includes not only a love for God, but a hatred of anything that is opposed to God. Fourth tertiary point. Another affection that is exercised in Christian zeal is a spirit of jealousy for God. Zeal and jealousy in the original of the New Testament are the same word. He that has a spirit of true Christian zeal is zealous for the cause of Christ. Okay, so this is a little bit interesting because it's not common that Edwards remarks on Greek words and their definitions. But here, one of the things he says under the fourth tertiary point is that to be jealous for God's glory is the same thing as to be zealous for God. Jealousy and zealousy are of the same thing. Now, God is described as jealous for his own glory, and Edwards is arguing here that a person is zealous as he takes up God's jealousy for himself. Okay? Fifth sub-tertiary point, another affection that's exercised in true zeal is courage, a spirit of fortitude in enervating the difficulties that are in the way of doing God's will and the enemies that oppose his glory. So if a person is going to be truly zealous for the glory of God, one thing that they surely should not lack is courage in order to actually do things for the glory of God. You can't just be zealous sitting at home thinking, very fervent thoughts, but a zealous person actually goes out and does something mighty and even courageous for the glory of God. Now, that's the first sub-point under the first heading, and now we're going to get into the second one. Thankfully, this one does not have as many tertiary points underneath it. So secondly, as to the manner wherein these affections are exercised in true zeal, it is with ardor or fervency of spirit. That divine love, which is the main thing in Christian zeal, is a powerful principle. 'Tis a fire kindled in the soul by the active sunbeams of the sun of righteousness. Now, this is an interesting one because it's very Edwardsian. Edwards loves the idea of the sun and its flames and its heat and its light. It's an image that he comes back to quite a bit. And notice here, there's kind of a beautiful language here of zeal being a fire that's kindled where? It's kindled in the soul of the person. How so? By the sunbeams of the Son of Righteousness. So the picture here is that even as God is righteous, his holiness emanates outward, and that actually catches on fire in the heart of the believer. A kind of beautiful illustration there, isn't it? Third subpoint under the first heading. Third, as to the acts which this virtue exerts itself, in one word, it is the pursuing of the glory of God. 'Tis not all her holy fervency of spirit that is properly intended by zeal, but it is a holy fervor of mind as it relates to practice only. Remember, he called it a mental affection. It's not just the fire of the heart, but it's also something of the mind, as it relates to the practice only or the pursuit of the glory of God as those things that are well-pleasing to him. Okay, now finally we make it to the third subpoint under the first heading, and here there's going to be a couple of other tertiary points, so here we go. These acts of zeal are exercised in two kinds. A prosecuting that which tends to promote God's glory, as when a person exercises fervency of spirit in doing good works, and loving and glorifying God and ourselves, or to promote such things in others. So to prosecute, we may think of as a kind of a legal word here, but in this case, it means to really go after it, to pursue it, to hunt it down, to go after it and get it. And then, second tertiary point under the third sub, it appears in a fervency of spirit in opposing those things that are against God's honor. So it was that Phinehas manifested his zeal when he took the javelin for which God did so greatly reward him. And here he cites Numbers 25. Now this is something that is very commonly done as well, is that Edwards and many other of the Puritans, they would hearken unto other biblical passages to illustrate the main one that they're looking at here. And so that's kind of a good rule of preaching. If you're out there, preachers, remember, if you're preaching doctrine, it's good to move to a narrative illustration, which Edwards does here. And if you're preaching narrative, then you should illustrate it by doctrinal assertions. And so in that way, doctrine and narrative, they help elucidate one another, and Edwards does that perfectly here in this particular instance. Please be reminded, too, that in any one of these points or subpoints that we've been looking at, there's more there. There's more paragraphs, more illustrations, more ideas. I'm just giving the skeletal outline of this entire sermon for you so you can see it. Now, next, we come to the second doctrinal heading, okay? Having thus shown what true zeal is, I proceed now in the second place to show that zeal is an essential virtue of a Christian, insomuch that not only is true zeal a noble attainment of a Christian, but he that is not a zealous Christian is not allowed in Scripture to be any true Christian. In other words, if you are a true Christian, you should have zeal. Okay, so having first of all defined what zeal is in the first portion of the doctrinal section, now he's going to show us that it's an absolutely essential thing that true Christians would have. Now suppose that you're totally lost here in our doctrinal argument. Well, let's just look at our exploded diagram again and just see where we are. So we went from the first main, first sub, 5 tertiary points, second sub, no tertiary points, third sub, 2 tertiary points, and now we're here to the second main. Now, looking at the structure of the second main point, we notice that he has a first, second, and third sub, but there are not too many tertiary points, if any. But under the third sub, he's going to do something interesting, which is to bring up another classic Puritan technique, which is the rise of an objection. Okay, so Edwards is going to anticipate that somebody may disagree with him, and then he's going to answer that twice before moving on to the fourth sub-point under the second main heading. Okay, so here we go. Let's go through it. First, this is the qualification principally by which true Christians are distinguished from those who are lukewarm. Now here you can see why this is a revival sermon. He's going to challenge the people in the pews to regard whether or not they happen to be lukewarm or zealous. The Scripture distinguishes mankind into 3 sorts: those that are cool, those that have no appearance or show of religion, and are not to be looked upon as visible Christians, and those that are hot, i.e. those that are true Christians that are fervent in spirit. Of course, he's referring to Revelation there in the Laodicean letter. Next, second, this is one thing wherein the power of godliness appears and wherein it differs from the form of it. These two are spoken of by the apostle in 2 Timothy 3:5, the one as being peculiar to true Christians, the other common to hypocrites with them. So here again, he's challenging the people to consider whether or not they might actually be hypocrites. Next, third, an indifferent and lukewarm spirit does in no wise become the nature of divine objects. Divine objects are infinitely great, immensely surpassing all temporal things in their importance and excellency. Okay, so if you find lukewarmth in yourself, Edwards is going to hold that this is certainly a problem. Next, and here comes that objection. We're moving through this rather quickly here. The objection is this, viz., how could it be necessary that men, in order to be a true Christian, should love God above all things else in the world, when we are so often taught that true Christians have so little grace and so much corruption? Okay, so here he brings in the point of sin. Well, essentially here, even though we are believers and we're regenerated and we have the Holy Spirit living in us, yet we still have sin reigning in our hearts. Well, it no longer reigns, we might say, but it remains in our hearts. We still struggle with a depraved nature. We fall every day. We continue to break the 10 Commandments. We do not love God as much as we ought, nor do we love our neighbor as we ought to. So he says, that being true, how can you then argue that zeal is nevertheless essential for the Christian? Well, now he's going to answer that twice. He's going to give 2 different answers to that objection. First answer, 'Tis from the nature of the object loved rather than the degree of the principle in the lover. The object beloved is of supreme excellency, of a loveliness immensely above all. So here his answer is, well, it's not because you're great, but because God is great. And remember that image of the sun catching on fire, the heart. Well, it's not how much your heart burns, but rather how hot the sun is in glory. And then his second answer is this. Another way whereby grace is predominant in the soul of a saint is by the virtue of the covenant of grace and the promises of God on which Christian grace relies, and which engages God's strength and assistance to be in its side and to help it against its enemy, which would otherwise be overpowered. And so here, Edwards pulls on the language, the traditional Puritan language of the covenant of grace, and here he insists that it's really grace that carries the day, not necessarily the strength of the resolve of that particular individual. And then finally we come then to the fourth sub under the second main. Fourth and last reason why zeal is an essential virtue of a Christian, that affection that is short of this don't agree with the work that a Christian has to do. The work that a Christian is called is the work of a soldier. It's a warfare. He's not called to sleep, but to conflict with principalities and powers and rulers in the darkness of this world, with spiritual wickedness in high places. So here he says, look, you have such a determined enemy in the devil, the flesh, and the world. You're going to get run over by these enemies, even the enemy of your own self, if you do not have zeal. That's why it's essential to us, because the spiritual warfare is so heavy, okay? And with that, thankfully, we have completed the doctrinal section of this particular sermon. Now, you may be feeling absolutely exhausted because Edwards took that doctrine from every possible angle that he could come at it. But finally, we come then to the application section. And in this particular instance, at least we can say that the application is shorter than the doctrine. Edwards really let us have it in the doctrinal section this time. And again, that could typically be reversed. Sometimes the application is huge. In this case, though, it's not quite that overbearing. In fact, he's going to give us two kinds of applications here. The first kind of application is what he's going to call the use of examination. Now, this is a very standard Puritan model here. The Puritans use this all the time. The application of examination means just look into your own heart. You're supposed to examine your heart. Don't worry about the neighbor next to you. Don't worry about society as a whole yet. But first of all, look into your own heart. So this is the use of examination. If it be thus, this should put persons on examining themselves, classic language here, whether or no they are possessed of this virtue. In other words, you've heard all this about zeal. Do you have it or not? Have you a fervency of spirit for God's being served and honored? Do you have that holy ardor of soul to prosecute those things and tend to advance the interest of religion and in opposing those things that are against it? Now, here's where, again, we're going to break into some sub-points here. So under the first use of examination, we're going to see several sub-points. We're used to them by now, and this is standard Edwardian preaching as well as standard Puritan preaching. A true Christian zeal is a zeal according to knowledge, okay? Every true grace has its foundation in light. What is counterfeit has its foundation in darkness. A false zeal, there is heat, but without light, which a certain author says is like hellfire. But Christian zeal is fire from heaven. So here he brings up an interesting point, that if you find yourself having zeal in your heart, you still have to be careful whether or not it's the good kind of zeal, because there is, of course, that evil form of zeal, which is zealous for wrong things, ungodly things, perverse things. So the fact that you're strongly opinionated, or the fact that your personality is inclined to intensity, that doesn't mean it's real zeal. True Christian zeal must be, he says, according to knowledge. Not only that, a man rightly zealous exercises his zeal in the first place of his own sins. Okay, this is great here, because again, if you think zeal is being angry that somebody else is a wicked sinner, Edward says, no, you need to check your own heart first and foremost. But still under examination, he's got a couple more subs. A truly Christian zeal is such as attended with humility. Okay, here's something interesting, because you might think that a zealous person is courageous and bold and brash and just stomps all over everybody else. But no, Edward says that kind of real Christian zeal is also filled with humility. And not only that, but fourthly, a true zeal is not inconsistent with the spirit of love and meekness. If you're going to be filled with zeal, please, by all means, be a loving, meek, gentle, and gracious kind of zealousy here. Now, that's it for self-examination. Now, typically there could be all kinds of these other uses, but here in this particular sermon, the only other kind of application that he's going to give is exhortation. So, whereas an examination is look into yourself, now under exhortation, he's going to tell you what you ought to do. You ought to do something about all this. Use 2 of exhortation to exhort persons to be zealous in religion. Obviously, this is the main point of the sermon. Be zealous. Don't content yourself with a dead form of religion when your heart is but little engaged in it under a notion that your first work is right. A right first work always has this effect. It leaves in persons an abiding principle of holy zeal in religion. But here we go. We have a couple of subs, and then we're almost done, I promise. First of all, in exhorting, how dishonorable to God is a cold and indifferent spirit to his service. Now here you can tell Edwards is hoping to whip his congregation back into a state of spiritual fervor. Remember, the 1735 revival came through Northampton locally and somewhat regionally, but by 1740, things are starting to happen on a more cross the colonies level here. And Edwards doesn't want his people to miss this. So he's really going to hammer them home here about indifference and lukewarmth. Secondly, how men are wont to resent coldness and indifference in those that profess friendship to them, that lukewarm Christians manifest towards God. He does not want them to be lukewarm. Third, under exhortation, let us consider what a shame it will be if we are lukewarm in God's service, considering how zealous men commonly are in serving themselves in the pursuit of the world. He says to the church, look out. Don't you see how this revival is breaking out again? You don't want to be like the lukewarm. It would be shameful for you to be lukewarm in this way. And so Edwards is really going to hammer this home. And then on this note, the way in which men commonly serve mammon is not to serve it with a backwardness and indifferency, but with great warmth and zeal. Edwards is going to begin to wind down the sermon, and that is pretty much the end of this particular sermon. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly how long this would have taken to preach out loud, but you get the understanding, I think, that basically every Puritan sermon, and let me just call this back if I can, real quick. Every Puritan sermon worked on these 3 premises: the text, the doctrine, and the application. And then the complexity of the sermon was really relative to what the preacher was trying to accomplish in any given sermon. Here, Edwards is very much obviously stressing definitions and an understanding that all true Christians should be zealous for the glory of God. Okay, well, thanks for hanging in with me with that. I hope that was somewhat helpful to you. Now you know what it might be like to sit through a Puritan sermon. And again, if you thought that was really interesting, let me just remind you one more time that my book on joy is available both in paperback and in Audible, and I'll post links in the description of this video if you're interested in getting that. Well, that's all I've got for you today. We ran about 27 minutes. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for checking in. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.